The purpose of the Georgetown Center is to assemble scholars, policymakers, business people, to engage in thoughtful discussions, debate, dialogue on issues that lie at the nexus of business and public policy.
To me, there is a very close association between the degree of rebalancing in the world economy and the strength of the recovery.
We need to have a sustainable recovery, two kinds of rebalancing, as you put it. Demand has to shift from deficit countries to surplus ones, away, if you will, from the overburdened US consumer to the undershot Chinese consumer. And internally, we have to shift to a greater reliance on private demand. We can't run huge deficits forever. The trouble is that neither of these rebalancings are really happening. The external rebalancing is pretty much ground to a halt. We're all very focused on the demand side of the economy now, but think about the supply side, the trend growth rate of economies. And let me give you 3 reasons for worrying. One is that high unemployment risks becoming structural. When you've got a lot of people out of work for a long time, they lose skills, they become harder to re-employ. The US is not going to make the same mistakes that Europe did in the 1980s, where it basically helped entrench high unemployment. But nonetheless, I worry here that some proportion of unemployment is becoming structural. Secondly, that as public debt rises, at some point down the road, higher public debt will crowd out private investment and hurt growth. We don't know exactly when that happens, but at some point it is going to. And thirdly, and we often forget this, large chunks of the rich world are going to be slowing anyway because of demographics.
Just focus on five points. First, the kind of nature of fiscal policy, and both Zani's remarks, but also Olivier's stress on the anchor. I'm going to say a few things about that. Second, on the G20 process and the rebalancing issue. Third, Olivier said, you know, when you look at profits and cash flow, there should be a tremendous recovery right now. When you look at expected sales, different story. And I'm going to try to come back to that point. A few words on Europe, and finally a concluding thought on the world economy's more medium-term future. But I do want to stress, and I'm not a Ricardian by a long shot, but there is a little bit, sometimes too much talk, that you can fine-tune parts of fiscal policy, you know, and give short-term stimulus and then, you know, immediately announce with it longer-term restrictive policies. I don't think one has to be a kind of convinced Ricardian to say that if you tell us that, you know, you cut my tax this year and increase it next year, my behavior is likely to react to both and not just to this year's tax cut. And therefore, it's not so easy to modulate fiscal policy in such a way that you kind of fine-tune it by offering short-term stimulus and longer-term consolidation.
The two things which I find very interesting, one is the growth prospect of emerging markets looks substantially better than the advanced economies. And the second thing which is remarkable is that the type of debates we're having in advanced economies used to be the debates we used to have for emerging markets. Two of the issues that worry me, which all the speakers have already mentioned. One is this rebalancing of private spending to make sure that it stays in line with private income. Again, the issue that debt levels in the private sector grew faster than what they should have grown. Now, to me, it is very unclear how that's going to happen in a way which is going to lead to a growth rate which is similar to what we've seen in the past. Again, as an individual, if I realize that I'm poorer than where I was before, I need to adjust my spending. Now, my income doesn't change, my GDP doesn't change. Now, the problem is if I live in a country where my spending is the income of someone else, then that's going to start affecting the GDP of someone else. So unless we can find a magical way of all that reduction in spending to fall on other countries, that will keep putting enormous pressure on the activity in this country, in the US. Now, there are some stories, something could happen to the exchange rate, there could be maybe some policies that will help that, but if you look at history, it is unclear how that can happen in a smooth way over a short period of time.
I understand how a general purpose technology in a macro sense leads to less employment, but what's your views on the role of information technology and how much of that really is to blame for the structural unemployment we see now?
I would say that, I think there are lots of studies that show that it definitely is a factor, and there is labor-saving technical progress going on worldwide. But on the other hand, if you look at the exact timing, you know, when these technologies take hold and what happened to unemployment, I think the relationship is much weaker. And so I would say that a good chunk of it is much more macroeconomic.
What we see in the 1990s, the period of the greatest introduction, is an impact on the composition of the labor force, but not the growth rate of private sector jobs.
It is very dangerous for an economy to fall in the liquidity trap. And if anybody had doubts, studying Japan for 15 years and studying what we have the margin of in some of the other advanced countries today, should convince anybody that that's a place where you don't want to be. Now, can you avoid being in the liquidity trap? Well, if you have more room with monetary policy to react when an adverse shock comes, then you're less likely to hit zero nominal interest rate bound and so on. So the argument was that if you choose a very low inflation target on average, and the real interest rate is not very large, then you're going to be operating on average at, say, 4%. So the most you can do when a bad shock comes is decrease your interest rate by 4%, and then you're stuck.
In analyzing the situation, I think it is well documented that the income distribution has changed quite dramatically in quite a few countries, not everywhere, but in quite a few, and particularly in the US and in China. So I think that's a fact. We can look at the numbers, and that would have an impact, not just on the structure of demand, because one theory is just, you know, different types of goods will be demanded, but there's no aggregate demand effect. I think at least during longish transition periods, I think there can be impact on the overall demand.
I'm somewhat, I think that it would be a very neat story to say that rising income inequality was the core cause of the crisis and was the core cause of the weak recovery. It seems to me that it's quite hard to say that income inequality is the source of weakness of demand. I mean, certainly in the decade prior to the crisis, that's not true. It's also, I think, hard to draw a very simple connection between income inequality and the confluence of factors that drove this financial crisis. I think the proximate cause was the nature of financial liberalization and the distortionary subsidies that are there in the US. Now, you can tell a political economy story that part of that came about because of finding ways to assuage the middle and low-income workers who weren't getting real wage increases. But I think it's quite a complex story. But I think the sort of interesting thing is, even if you accept that, what's the sort of policy consequence? Does that mean you should have more redistributive tax policy?
Just one thing, I think on the redistributive impact of government, one has to look at taxes and expenditures. I mean, education, health expenditures, all these things together give you the impact of public policy on income distribution, not just tax rates.
And you would think that you would put the US way further down if you were all this together?
Of course, absolutely. Mainly through the education and health channels compared to Europe.
I really see my role as that these days of the United States, which is to welcome the most brilliant minds from around the world. One of the things that creates great strength in the U.S. economy and American society